And I now give the floor to the representative of Syria. You have the floor. Or the Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to indicate the importance of political and legal analysis that was just made by my colleague, the permanent representative of Venezuela. Mr. President, the international system has understood that the question of the protection of civilians in armed conflicts cannot be selective or discretionary, and it cannot be exclusively limited to armed conflicts. Therefore, we think, along with the majority of the international community, we think that the protection of Palestinian, Syrian, and Lebanese civilians living under Israeli occupation is a main and important component of this appreciated international effort in the framework of the objective and precise fulfillment of the mandate that is being set out under this item, entitled the protection of civilians in armed conflicts, particularly that the Council has been discussing this very important question for a long time in light of Israel's continued violations against the civilian populations in the occupied Arab land. Mr. President, we are indeed concerned that some of the member countries whose statements relevant to the protection of civilians in armed conflicts have been heard during the deliberation of this August Council. Those countries have had sometimes their own selective, special concept of civilians and armed conflicts, which contradicts the international humanitarian law and international jurisprudence. We are also concerned that some are trying to transform the sufferings of some civilians in some conflict areas, who sometimes think that these conflicts cannot be accepted, are transforming this suffering to controversial academic debate that does not lead to the alleviation of sufferings of civilians. Jurisprudence states that the international efforts aimed at protecting the civilians in conflict, in time of conflict, should be in strict compliance with the principles of the United Nations Charter that calls for the respect of the sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity of the states, and the non-interference in their internal affairs, and calls for the necessity that these efforts should be in line with the provisions of the Geneva Conventions and the international humanitarian law. All international instruments stress the fact that national governments shoulder the primary responsibility to provide protection for their citizens. This responsibility is exclusive and cannot be exchanged or influenced to serve political agendas. Consequently, we should not confuse the question of protecting civilians with the threats that are posed against international and peace international peace and security. It is also important to avoid using broad terminology for the question of the protection of civilians and the use of controversial terminology outside the literature of the United Nations, such as the responsibility to protect and the humanitarian intervention. This will certainly lead to the jeopardizing of the credibility and impartiality of the United Nations, whether at the level of the member states or at the level of the General Secretariat. This will lead to the undermining of the noble objectives that are made to protect the civilians in armed conflicts. What is paradoxical that with the development of the concepts of international law, both public law and humanitarian law over the last decades, the sufferings of the civilians have worsened. On the contrary, the number of conflicts has even increased.
وتفاقمت ظاهرة إعفاء سلطات الغزو العسكري والاحتلال الأجنبي من تبعات وعواقب انتهاكها.
Those countries who have militarily occupied other countries in violation of the international law and disrespect for the principles of the international humanitarian law have benefited from immunity. Allow me to put the following questions to this August Council. Where the occupation of member countries of the United Nations and invading them militarily outside international legitimacy and the killing of millions of the citizens of these countries, were these practices for the benefit or in the goal of providing protection of civilians? Was the call by some countries in this council today and on other occasions, was their call to change the regime in some countries under the pretext of providing protection for the civilians of these countries? Were these or was this call considered as a noble objective, or does this goal serve the noble objective of providing protection for civilians in armed conflicts? Does the suffering of millions of civilians because of unilateral sanctions, does it serve the livelihood of these citizens? Does it protect them, or does it weaken them and jeopardizes the right to live in dignity and development? Fourth, how can we understand some NATO members killing 130,000 Libyan civilians on the pretext of protecting civilians in Libya? How can we understand the call by the spokesperson of the U.S. State Department to armed groups in Syria not to turn themselves in or their weapons to the authorities of the Syrian government, in line with the Syrian government's decision to amnesty all those who turn themselves in and turn the weapons in to the government authorities? Doesn't this mean that America is publicly and directly taking part in exacerbating the discord and violence in Syria? Discord and violence have cost our people, our army, our police and civilians a lot of civilian victims. This incitement to the armed groups to continue their criminal acts against the state and against the civilians. Shouldn't this be a reason to hold those who were behind this incitement to be held accountable, at least in the framework of providing protection for civilians? Doesn't the American policy supported by some European country jeopardize the work of the Arab League and its initiative aimed at putting an end to the crisis in Syria and restore security and stability for civilians? Isn't remaining silent towards Israel's settlement activities, which jeopardize the principle of peace, isn't it a contradiction with the most fundamental rights of the civilians to live in their homelands in freedom and sovereignty? Mr. President, we do not know how long can we close our eyes to Israel's continued occupation of Arab-occupied territories, including the Syrian Golan, Jerusalem, the Shaba farms and the Al-Gajar village, or the inhumane practices by Israel. Why don't we see the same degree of enthusiasm expressed in dealing with Israeli aggressions by some countries who expressed their interest in providing protection to civilians in some parts in the world? They used the Security Council, which is specialized in international peace and security, to have us adopt a faulty reading and a faulty interpretation of the question of providing protection for civilians in armed conflict, including interfering in the internal affairs of the member countries. We have not even heard any UN official who have taken part in this important debate and who are responsible for this important matter to speak about the illegality and unlawfulness of the interference, unacceptable interference in the internal affairs of the member countries, pursuant to the provisions of the of Article 2 of the Charter. Mr. President, those colonial countries, and in particularly France and Great Britain, who spoke this morning before this council and who used indecent terms against my country, they are wrong to think that the human memory will be unable to recall the crimes against humanity that were perpetrated by their countries during the eras of colonization and slavery. Isn't apologizing for these crimes compatible with the concept of the protection of civilians? Or are there different categories and classes of civilians? Some of them are from the north and some of them are from the south, and they are not equal under humanity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.